Hello, good morning, good day. I'm Paul Hebinck. I'm presenting here my work on processes of agricultural development in South Africa or in Africa at large. My interest is in processes of re-agrarianisation. So I'm here to debate this whole notion of de-agrarianisation, right? And I'm using material from the Eastern Cape to underpin my argumentation. So my interest is in 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 de-agrarianisation or agrarianisation, and I see that and I approach that as a sort of as an assemblage, right? So that's my theoretical interest in studying processes of agriculture development, perceiving agriculture as a socio-material assemblage constituted by and formed by the forming of different connections between the social and the material, and reconnecting new resources, connecting old resources in new ways. And that all happens in a particular time and space. So deagrarianization and reagrarianisation occur in the same time and space dimension, in the same place, right? So when we look at the homelands, for instance, or an agriculture area across the world, we see different kinds of assemblages, different social, spatial, material connections, different infrastructures, different kinds of networks, and they all assemble or reassemble different kinds of development patterns or processes. With regard to the Eastern Cape, I've called these two processes sort of contrasting processes, homesteading on the one hand and production at scale on the other hand. So re-agrarianisation in the context of the former homelands has an interesting opportunity to sort of begin to perceive the homelands as a space of opportunity, a space of opportunity around or constituted by project initiated by people themselves, those that sort of initiate the agrarianisation or the re-agrarianisation. And what is interesting is that I find that these processes of re-agrarianisation occur more or less autonomous or relatively autonomous from the state, right? So the homelands appear as spaces of opportunities rather than as problem areas, right? So this is turning the image of the homelands upside down, right? I'm not denying that de-agrarianisation is not occurring. No doubt it does, and there's lots of material, lots of papers that actually argue that, and they give you in detail the reasons and why, the drivers of why de-agrarianisation occurs next to poverty or destitution or violence. I'm not denying that, but I want to sort of cast my eye on contrasting processes that I've coined re-agrarianisation. So my project, my sort of intellectual project, involves debating the received wisdoms that you find in the literature and you come across in the policy networks when you start interacting with the policy field in areas like the Eastern Cape, right? If you look at their policies, there's a remarkable continuity over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, I would say, whereby so there's a common line in the policy development, in the formulation and implementation, that it doesn't resonate with what is actually happening in the village, right? If you look at the current program Fesat Lala, which is a sort of a continuation of homeland policies, of massive food production, initiated after 95, agri-parks. These are constructs that come from the idea. Uh, Basically, they do not connect with what's happening in the villages. They are not connecting to the assemblages that we find operating in the homelands, right? And obviously, the kind of agriculture, either in home gardens or in the arable fields that is happening, is not perceived as significant or valued as progressively contributing to reduction of poverty and sustaining or producing some kind of food security, right? what actually the policies do is continuously imposing one standard of farming, those of the commercial, modern farming, on other categories of farmers, the so-called smallholder farming or homeland farmer. Okay, the policy debate, I think, needs to be fertilized, needs to be infused by new ideas, new concepts, good empirically grounded theory and research that actually sort of speeds up the process and speeds up the debate into the direction sort of, let's see what's happening and let's see what we can do and let's see what people do themselves, right? So that debate needs to be fertilized, but I think that the academic debate also needs to be fertilized with ideas, right? What I feel predominant in the literature is that the homelands have been constituted as a labor reserve for capital accumulation elsewhere. The typical sort of labor migration theories developed by people like Wolper, right? Labor is drawn away from productive use. They're going to work elsewhere. They're being forced to work elsewhere. There's a lot of literature that actually sort of gives a different perspective. I'm not going into that here now, but the mines, the commercial farms, estates, industry, transport, the cores of capitalist development in South Africa sort of have drawn away labor from the so-called reserves, right? And they became dumping grounds for people that were superfluous, were surplus people, right? They were dumped in the Ciskei or the Transkei, overcrowded, hence soil erosion, hence more intervention, more attempts to sort of reorganize agriculture the way the policymakers thought that agriculture should be organized, right? So this is the argument for reagrarianisation. Right? Okay. Interestingly, in the literature, whether it's from a political economy perspective or whether it's from, let's say, a classic agricultural economic point of view, deagrarianisation is a linear process. It's an inevitable outcome, structural outcome of development. There is an automatic kind of processes in a process ongoing in development that says that agriculture becomes less important macroeconomically. There will be a shift from, let's say, smallholder farming, small-scale farming, to more modern farming, to more entrepreneurial farming, or to more corporate farming. The land will be left alone. There will be fallow land in the former homelands, and these are the concepts that have been used to sort of to explain the drivers behind deagrarianisation. On top of that, people increasingly live on purchased food, right? They're not living on food that they are producing themselves or hardly producing themselves. But if you do work in villages like I do for quite a long time, for over 25 years now, I'm working in two villages in the Central Eastern Cape. I come there at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, depending on the funding, right? Based on the observations that I regularly have and my discussions with people, I see people coming back to the land. Former migrants that have worked as police officers or as teachers or as miners go back to the village and actually start farming again. Others that I found in the village have continuously farmed, right, over a longer period of time. They straddled urban and rural spaces through migration and actually invested in opportunities to continue farming, sometimes interrupted for a few years and then picked up again, right? So this is actually the pattern that you see over the last 120 years in the villages of Guquka and Koloni. You know, let's say past labor, former migrants working around the turn of the century, 1900, in the mines. They came home for Christmas, started plowing their fields with the money, of course, paid by the money from their wages. And some of it was invested in cattle. Some of it, of course, was invested in food or in beer parties or whatsoever, right? This is well documented. So in other words, the fields that have been there always, the arable fields far away, sometimes close to the homestead, sometimes far away from the homestead, have been reactivated, right? Idle fields that have been reactivated by the returning migrants. Okay, so reagrarianisation is there to to trigger our imaginations. At least my sociological imaginations are triggered by that, right? So that there are a few concepts actually that emerge in the literature and in debates with my colleagues in South Africa and across Africa to discuss these processes of re-agrarianisation. Right? Farming, and that's key, is more than only cropping. You know, people like Charlie and Shona Shackleton have been playing that argument already for quite some time. Particularly harvesting is one of their specialities, right? The second point is the idea of markets. Markets are absent, do the agriculture economists say. We need to introduce markets. That's why we have agri-parks. Well, if you carefully look in the villages, you find a lot of markets, homestead or village markets, that actually supply particular homesteads and villages. There's also a lot of food bought by visitors coming from the urban areas at times of rituals or just a visit, and people bring food, and there's a lot of exchange in that kind of, and I'm ready to call it a market, right? Of course, the farming is not a pure rational economic activity framed in terms of productivity and in terms of quantity. No, it is about quality of life. It's embedded and shaped by cultural repertoires. Religious values are part of it. And the landscape is a ritual landscape, is a religious landscape. And so the meaning of land and working on the land has a social meaning. Notions like undercultivation, land abandonment, that are often used in the literature are, in my view, analytically and historically incorrect and not very much useful. And the notion of activation that leads to either deactivation or reactivation, I think is much more accurate in actually explaining what we are interested in what's happening in the villages. You find fields suddenly being activated, right? And abundant leaves this idea, or undercultivation leaves that idea that these things are happening and will never return to a full use again, right? So activation gives this active moment in land use. And we need to go beyond linear thinking, right? We have to keep an eye on unexpected surprises, right? Even if you believe in linear development, you will not escape that sometimes things are happening that you cannot explain. This is what I call the unexpected, right? And the unexpected is linked to beyond linear thinking models. So re-agrarianisation thus involves the continuous reassembling of the social and material environment, making new connections socially, spatially, materially, infrastructurally. And this is not necessarily family or class-based, right? It could be based on individuals, could be based on people that actually part of a network where elements of the network are still in town, and some of the network, you know, live in the village and they farm. I've seen a few land reform farms that actually work like that. And my argument, it is not just the returning migrant or the returning teacher or the richer people in the village that actually continue or have reactivated their fields either recently or a long time ago already, right? Okay, I think that's important, and I hope to be working on that in the next coming few years when I have time and money to do that, right? Okay, and like I've said in the beginning, processes of de- and re-agrarianisation operate simultaneously in the same time and space, which means they coexist, they interact, I think. And that's my argument that I want to develop through fieldwork, is that through interaction, they also learn from each other, they transform each other, right? So that's a point that I need to develop further with fieldwork. I've developed a special issue where I brought together for the Journal of Rural Studies a number of case studies across the world, including those from the Netherlands, including from Brazil, from cases from Brazil, from Turkey, from Philippines, from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, bringing that together in one special issue under the heading of debating de-agrarianisation. Okay. What is paramount in the study, in the process of studying and actually developing the argument of re-agrarianisation, is there are two key elements. One is longitudinal engagement. One is a longitudinal engagement um, with the field, like I do in this particular area in the Eastern Cape. A second element is competitive research. Competitive research, preferably across the continent in other areas of Africa. I work in West Kenya, I work in northeastern Zimbabwe, in the fast-track land reform areas of Zimbabwe. I do a lot of work in the northern parts of Namibia, in the communal areas. And I sometimes do a little bit of work with colleagues at Wageningen in the Netherlands or in the UK on issues of re-agrarianisation and actually representation. But that's a thing that I won't touch on in my presentation today. So this is my village, my favorite village. You know, two beautiful pictures taken in two different time frames, one in winter and one in summer. A familiar picture for most of us, right? So this picture, it's not very well drawn, but it expresses the kinds of, let's say, processes of reactivation and deactivation that I see occurring in villages in the Eastern Cape, right? I see a process of reactivation, perhaps not in terms of quantity and in terms of scale enormous, but it is there. So we need to pay attention to that. We see what I call a partial shift, a partial deactivation, the shift to home gardens. And you find people that actually worked in home gardens suddenly also starting to invest and open up edible fields again that they either have in the family or get from their uncle or from their neighbors. They use that, you know, occasionally, or they rent it for a few years. And I call that production at scale. People are keen on farming. They invest in cattle. They invest in poultry. They invest in tractors that they rent out, that makes money, that they can invest. So they're very keen to produce at scale, right? Which is significant. The other kind of farming that I've come across, I've lumped together under the notion of homesteading, right? People farm intensively, and we've seen presentations today, and there's quite a lot of literature on homesteading, on homestead food production, right? The intensity of food production produced at farmyards, at the back of the house, which is enormous. And there's a lot of money to be saved, like people say. This is why we use the notion farming to save money. Sean and I have been doing that work in the Transkei. Sort of that constitutes homesteading. Homesteading is more than only saving money. Homesteading is more than only producing food for the family. Homesteading is also to keep the homestead alive, to receive visitors from the urban areas, to have a space and place for the usual rituals. Right? Homesteading is also the place whereby people sort of come collect materials from the natural environment. They harvest grass, they harvest firewood, they harvest wild vegetables for rituals. So that sort of explains the relevance of homesteading, right? And it needs to be defended, needs to be maintained. It needs to be maintained throughout the year to receive families and to family members and keep the rituals going. If you look at the land patterns and the land use patterns in Guquka, there's a whole history of reassembling. And we have detailed that in the paper in that special issue for rural studies, and whereby over the years the blurring of landscape categories that have been introduced through land use planners in the mid 1980s, these categories are not there anymore. You know, the homesteads are you know, the fences between the homestead and the edible fields, and sometimes the communal grazing lands have disappeared, they've been stolen, they have not been maintained. The grazing committees that actually supervise the grazing of cattle in the communal lands, in the rangelands, but also in the arable fields after the harvest. They've disappeared, they've fallen apart, they've collapsed. So what you see is actually a continuum of growing, grazing, and gathering. You grow your crops, you graze your cattle, and you gather from the fields. Even the arable fields, the rangelands are used for gathering. So that's the core of homesteading. There's also a history of activation. Okay? Next to deactivation, there's continuous activated fields continuously being used. They're not many, but there are some fields continuously being used, and more recently you find reactivation. So there's continuity of farming somehow, right? It's not the scale that I find interesting, but people are attempting to produce food at a scale larger than the home garden. So one of my conclusions, I'm coming to the end of my talk now, is that deagrarianisation should not be viewed as a linear process. It's a non-linear process. It's a temporal phenomenon. So we have to keep an eye on processes of re-agrarianisation, the opposite, that happen next to that in the same time and space. The implications is that, like I said before, there's a need to revisit the homelands from backward stagnating to spaces of opportunities around reactivating our fields, right? The need to rethink development, right? We need to infuse this idea of development with new ideas of re-agrarianisation. That in itself, and in turn, leads to we need to start debating sort of the core of a new agriculture and rural development sort of strategy, perhaps for the Eastern Cape, perhaps larger for South Africa, around issues of re-agrarianisation, examining the conditions, who is re-agrarianising, who is reactivating his field, and on what conditions, and how do they feel, how do they reactivate the field, what kind of crops do they plant, how do they plant, etc. There's a lot of questions to be sort of looked at in more detail. Okay, thank you very much. If there are questions, please do not hesitate to put them in my email. Thank you. Bye.